The morning started like any other. Amira's alarm buzzed at precisely 6:30 a.m., rousing her from a restless sleep. She stretched, her fingers grazing the soft sheets, before she blinked away the remnants of a dream. The sun hadn't yet risen, but the pale light creeping through her bedroom window was enough to signal that it was time to get up. She shuffled into the bathroom, splashed cold water on her face, and stared at her reflection for a long moment. Another busy day ahead, she thought. Another day of pushing forward, of proving my worth. It wasn't a thought that troubled her. It was a rhythm she had grown accustomed to, a predictable, relentless march toward success. She knew exactly what needed to be done and how to do it. Amira had always been the type of person who thrived on structure. She'd spent years climbing the corporate ladder with an intensity that left little room for doubt. From the first day she entered the workforce, she threw herself into every project with an energy that was impossible to ignore. She had earned promotions and accolades, gained the respect of her colleagues, and built a reputation as someone who got things done. By the age of 33, she was a senior manager at one of the largest marketing firms in the city. But when she entered the glass-walled conference room, her assistant, Emily, was already there, her expression somber. "Good morning, Amira," Emily said quietly, her voice uncharacteristically soft. Amira smiled, trying to shake off the sudden unease that gripped her chest. "Morning, Emily. You're here early. Got everything ready for the presentation?" Emily nodded but didn't smile back. Instead, she hesitated, glancing at her phone before she spoke again, almost nervously. "I think you should read this," Emily said, handing her a printed document. Amira took the paper, feeling a flutter of unease now. Her eyes skimmed over the words quickly, and then she stopped, her gaze fixating on the subject line. Termination. Gnosis. Her heart skipped a beat. The room seemed to close in around her. Emily, watching her closely, cleared her throat. "I'm really sorry, Amira. They asked me to tell you as soon as you got in, but I didn't know how." Her voice was barely a whisper, filled with sympathy. Amira barely heard her. The ground felt like it had shifted beneath her feet. She blinked hard, struggling to maintain composure. Her breath came in short bursts, but she didn't cry. She wasn't sure if she was still in shock, or if she was simply too numb to feel anything. This can't be happening," Amira whispered, more to herself than to Emily. Emily shifted uncomfortably, her face full of guilt, but there was nothing she could do. Amira knew that. No one could change what had already been decided. The board had already made its choice, and nothing she could say would alter the outcome. As the clock ticked down to the end of her final day, Amira stood up from her desk and walked out of the office for the last time. The world seemed different, as though the rules had suddenly changed. Outside, the air felt heavier than usual, and the city streets looked foreign, unwelcoming. She was no longer a part of the team that had defined her for so long. It was as if her whole life had been built on a foundation of sand. And now, the tide had come in, washing it all away. The days after Amida's departure from the company felt like a blur of restless nights and endless repetitive thoughts. At first, there was shock, a numbness that had kept her from fully processing the depth of her situation. But that initial disbelief quickly gave way to the harsh reality that life had abruptly shifted in ways she hadn't anticipated. The bright future she had imagined for herself now seemed distant, like a dream that was fading just out of reach. She tried to stay positive in the beginning. She told herself that this was just a temporary setback. After all, she had built a career from the ground up. She could do it again. With her experience and skill set, surely the right opportunity would come. But as the weeks passed, that optimism began to wear thin, replaced by frustration and, more insidiously, self-doubt. Amira spent her mornings scouring job boards, refreshing LinkedIn every hour, applying to positions and updating her resume, again and again. But despite her efforts, the response was always the same: Silence. The worst part wasn't the rejections. It was the feeling of being invisible. It felt like no one saw her anymore, not in the way they used to. She had been a high performer, a leader who had made things happen, but now she was just another resume in a sea of hundreds, maybe thousands. By the third week, the nagging voice in her head started to grow louder. Maybe I'm not as valuable as I thought. Maybe I'm too old for this industry. Maybe they were right to let me go. She forced herself out of bed every morning, but even simple tasks felt overwhelming. The days blurred together. She lost track of the time, of the seasons changing, of the small victories she used to celebrate. The person she used to be, the one who was always on top of things, seemed to be slipping away. Amira's social media profiles began to feel like a cruel reminder of everything she had lost. Her LinkedIn page, once a glowing testament to her career, now seemed like an obituary to a life she couldn't bring herself to let go of. Every time she looked at it, the carefully curated image of a successful, high-powered woman felt like a mask that no longer fit. She began to withdraw from social media altogether, avoiding LinkedIn updates and the posts from her former colleagues who had moved on, still thriving in their careers. At first, she told herself it was okay to take a break. She had earned a little time to rest, to clear her head. But after the first week of quiet, the silence became deafening. She found herself waking up in the middle of the night, unable to sleep, her mind racing with anxiety. Every financial obligation, her rent, utilities, insurance, felt like a ticking clock, an ever-growing reminder of how little time she had to figure things out. Her savings had always been enough to cushion any emergency, but now it felt like a fragile safety net she was clinging to. She tried to push down the rising panic, telling herself she was doing the right things. She was networking, she was applying. Eventually, the right opportunity would come, but the waiting was a relentless torment. She tried to stay busy. She cleaned out her closets. She started reading books she'd put off for years. She began doing yoga in the mornings, hoping it would bring some calm. But nothing seemed to quell the mounting frustration. She hated the feeling of being stuck, of being untethered from a future she had worked so hard to create. One afternoon, after an especially grueling phone interview with a startup that ultimately decided to go in a different direction, Amira collapsed onto the couch, her hands shaking. She had prepared for the call, studied the company, and tailored her answers to fit what she thought they were looking for. But in the end, it hadn't mattered. They had chosen someone else. Again, Amira stared at the ceiling, her mind spiraling into a place she hadn't visited in years. What if I'm not good enough? Oh, she tried to dismiss the thought, but it clung to her like a shadow. If they're not hiring me, then maybe I'm not cut out for this anymore. Maybe my best years are behind me. Maybe I've hit my peak. The worst part was that no one seemed to understand. Her friends, her family, they all offered comforting words, trying to ease her pain. "You'll bounce back. You always do," her best friend Sarah had said during a phone call. "This is just a chapter, Amira. Don't let it define you." But they didn't see what she saw. They didn't understand how the world felt different now, how everything had changed. The longer she went without a job, the more she questioned her worth, the more she doubted that she had anything left to offer. Then there was the guilt. Amira had always been the strong one, the one who provided for herself and for her family when they needed it. Her parents had immigrated to the U.S. with nothing, and they had always been proud of how far she had come. The weight of that pride pressed down on her now, reminding her of all she had promised herself and them that she would accomplish. What would they think if they knew how close she was to giving up? The guilt gnawed at her when she took breaks, when she didn't feel like applying for yet another job, or when she wanted to disappear into a book or a long walk instead of making phone calls. What would they say if they knew how much she struggled to believe in herself anymore? Amira had always seen herself as a fighter, someone who would persevere no matter the odds. But the longer the struggle dragged on, the harder it became to hold on to that belief. It was a small, almost unnoticeable shift, a whisper of a thought. What if I could build something for myself? Amira had always been passionate about design. She had dabbled in creating logos and websites for small businesses over the years, but it had always been a side project. What if she turned that passion into a full-time venture? Could she create something meaningful on her own? The thought excited her, but it was terrifying at the same time. Could she take the leap? Would people trust her? She had no business experience, no brand recognition. But what did she have to lose? With a deep breath, Amira decided to give it a shot. She spent the next few months immersing herself in the world of design and branding. She took online courses, read books, and reached out to people in the industry. She learned the ins and outs of running a business, how to market herself, manage finances, and connect with clients. Building her design business was harder than she'd imagined. The first few months were filled with doubt, long nights, and endless work. She found herself juggling client meetings, drafts, and the occasional setback. Some projects didn't go as planned, and the clients weren't always easy to work with. But through it all, Amira found her passion reigniting. She realized that the struggle was part of the process. She learned from her mistakes, grew more resilient, and refined her craft. Slowly, but surely, she began to gain recognition. Word of mouth spread. Her portfolio grew. She started landing bigger projects and gaining more confidence. Her first major breakthrough came when a local business owner, impressed by her work, recommended her to a well-known tech startup. That project was a turning point. It catapulted her into the world of high-profile clients. Amira's business was growing, and with it, her belief in herself. 2 years after her fall, Amira stood in front of a new office, the doors to her very own design studio. The journey had been long and full of challenges, but every failure, every rejection, had led her to this moment. She looked out the window, watching the city skyline. It was a different world than the one she had once known. This was the result of hard work, dedication, and resilience. Her story wasn't just about overcoming the fall. It was about rising with strength, adaptability, and a renewed sense of purpose. Amira had not only rebuilt her life, but she had built it on her own terms. She smiled, feeling the rush of excitement she had once thought was gone forever. The rise after the fall had been more than just a comeback. It had been a transformation. Years later, Amira would become a mentor to others who were struggling, just as she had. She spoke at conferences, shared her story with those who were on the verge of giving up, and taught others that even in the darkest of times, the fall could be the catalyst for the rise. And in every conversation, every piece of advice, she reminded them, the fall is not the end, it's just the beginning of your rise.